289 would pull to 6,000 RPM in a heartbeat, if you'll pardon that expression. The Keiko 289 made 271 horsepower with a 450 lift solid camshaft, a cast iron intake manifold, and a tiny 480 CFM Holley 4-barrel carburetor. Thanks to its small size and its light weight, just 450 pounds, some big-time racers, from Colin Chapman to Dan Gurney to Carroll Shelby, found numerous uses for this engine. Ford's little V8 powered Jimmy Clark's Indianapolis 500 winning Lotus. 289 powered Mustangs and Cobras went on to own sports car and Trans Am racing. And this engine eventually morphed into the world-beating Boss 302.
It's funny, it doesn't get any respect, but it's the only American V8 to win the world, the world championship in FIA, sports car racing. Now, it didn't win NASCAR titles or drag racing titles per se, but the engine had a real good longevity to it. The design was so, not nearly perfect, but it was so robust that it could survive, and it survived from the early 60s up until just a few years ago.
Despite all the big block action on the street, small block lovers had one play yard that was reserved exclusively for them, Trans Am racing. And everybody had a dog in that hunt. We'll take the little engines out to the track when the American muscle car returns. One of the muscle car year's most exciting racing series never saw engines larger than 305 cubic inches. Of course, we're talking about Trans Am racing. Trans Am was a playground for some of the world's best drivers. Pushing Detroit iron around America's best road courses was a treat for world-class talent like Dan Gurney and Mark Donohue. And spectators soon became addicted to both the series and the cars. Needless to say, this did not go unnoticed in Detroit.
The factory Trans Am wars were really heating up on and off the track. By 70, Mopar was coming into the picture with its new Cuda and another dodgy body called the Challenger.
But Trans Am racing had a 5-liter limit on engine size. For Dodge and Plymouth, this was not a problem. They just left the big dogs on the porch and went hunting with their smallest engine, the 340. The 340 was the raciest member of Chrysler's LA engine family, which hit the streets in 1964 as a 180 horsepower, 273 cubic inch V8. But by 1966, the Commando 273 had beefed up to 275 horsepower, thanks to Chrysler's hot rod engineers.
273 is one of the greatest small blocks I think has ever made. It's very underrated, but if you look at the horsepower per cubic inch, it was a great engine. Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetor, solid lifter camshaft, and we had a limited production, very rare car called the old D Dart, which came out in the mid-60s, which is a special package for a customer to go right into NHRA stock eliminator racing.
By 1968, Mopar's small block now weighed in at 340 cubic inches, and it was one of the best designed little V8s anywhere.
340 is probably the most famous small block Chrysler ever made, and probably one of the best small blocks within the industry. Introduced in 1968, it's rated 275 horsepower, 10.5 to 1 compression ratio. When that engine was in a Barracuda Formula S or a Dodge Dart GTS or Swinger, it was a giant killer. These cars could drop a 396 Chevelle, no problem.
With a bore of 4.04 inches and a stroke of 3.31, the 340 used a forged steel crank and flat-top pistons to make 10.75 to 1 compression. A 430 lift cam and a Carter AVS 4-barrel carb helped this engine crank out 275 rated horsepower. The whole thing weighed just 539 pounds, and it fit nicely between the fenders of the Dart, the Cuda and Challenger, and the Demons and Dusters of the 70s. But where the 340 really made its reputation was right here, in Chrysler's Trans Am cars. This is the 340 six-pack, and it was a special version of this little motor made for going racing. Mopar's racing 340s were slimmed down to 303.8 cubic inches, by world-famous engine builder Keith Black. And they all used a special, stronger block, new heads with larger ports, Hemi valve train parts, and a few other goodies. In Dan Gurney's and Swede Savage's race cars, these engines made nearly 460 horsepower. The cool part of all this was, for the slightly more than 5,000 people who bought an AAR CUDA or a Challenger TA in 1970, you got the same high-strength block and the good heads, along with a very trick 3-Holly carb induction system. Nice deal, huh?
In 1970, Chrysler Corporation wanted to get into the Trans Am series, so they came out with a limited production AAR CUDAs and TA Challengers. The Chrysler engineers thought, let's do a 346 pack as an image builder. And they got what they LeBrock, and they had the 346 pack rated 290 horsepower. Again, it was another great motor. Unfortunately, it was only available for 1 year, but the parts are still available to make your own 346 pack today.
If you cruised with a Mopar 340 under your hood, or a 289, or a Ramrod 350, you knew that your little dog could run with the big dogs. But you had to choose who you ran with pretty carefully. Sometimes the toughest competition came from other small blocks. Stand by for some very tough competition when the American muscle car returns. The muscle car era was as much about the engines as it was about the cars. And to most enthusiasts, car companies have forever become identified with their best motors. When you think of Ford, you think of the big side-oiler 427s. When you think of Mopar, you think of the Hemi. And when you think of Chevrolet, you naturally think of this engine, the Chevy small block. The Chevrolet small block isn't just a famous engine, it's more than that. The small block defined Chevrolet for an entire generation.
It's just about impossible to overstate the significance of the Chevy small block. It really transformed not just Chevrolet Motor Division, but the whole industry, the whole muscle car scene for decades.
When it was introduced in 1955, this engine displaced 265 cubic inches. And almost immediately, everyone from corporate engineers to backyard hot rodders started making it bigger. This motor single-handedly saved the Corvette from 6-cylinder extinction. It created true street machines out of 4-door sedans. And in the trick of the decade, it did something nobody thought possible. It transformed dowdy, boring old Chevrolets into muscle cars.
It was really basically a combination of the two that combined performance with somewhat, if you like to call, high-performance reliability. The valves wouldn't float in it, and that was the purpose of that, to keep it, to give it higher upper RPM horsepower.
Through the years, the small block's growth curve has been nearly vertical, from 265 cubic inches in 1955 to 283 in 1957, to 327 in 1962, to 350 in 1970, to its ultimate displacement of 400 cubic inches in 1973. Chevrolet astonished the world by how much they could bore and stroke this motor. But when it came to the small block, size really didn't matter. Some of the raciest small blocks were tiny little engines.
There was the Fuelie 327s in the early Corvettes. There was L79, showed up in the Nova and in a handful of Chevelles. The LT1s came along in 70, 71, very hot solid lifter 350. L82 was the top engine during the smog years.
Thanks to the small block's size, weight, and phenomenal output, Chevy created some incredible cars around this motor, and most of those cars have become legends. Maybe the most awesome small block ever made was the 302 cubic inch engine that powered the Z28 Camaros to back-to-back championships in Trans Am racing. The 302 came out of Chevy's engine shop rated at 290 horsepower. But by the time it rolled off the starting grid in one of Roger Penske's Camaros, it was making 475 horsepower with practically no changes. This truly was the little engine that could.
One of the most important characteristics of a great design is its lifespan. Most engines stay in production for